So my name's Willy Maley, and I'm here to talk about my father, James Maley.
And nowadays you're an academic?
I'm an academic at the University of Glasgow.
So that's a journey itself from Postle Park or Barlanach or wherever you see.
It's quite a journey I made, yeah. For Postle Park, a school, I think there were just two boys that stayed on to the 5th year that were able to go to university, and I worked for 3 years before I did go. But it was an unusual journey. I'm a family of 9 kids. I was the 7th of 9, and I was the first in my family for as many generations as I can remember to go to university. I mean, neither of my parents ever went.
Fantastic. But we're here mostly, as you say, to talk about your dad, who also, did he grow up in Barlanach, or did he?
No, my father was born 1908, 19th of February, and he actually lived initially in Adelphi Street in the Gorbals, which is all kind of gone now. And then he lived in Stevenson Street, the Carlton. And that's where he grew up, essentially, was in the Carlton. And then from the 1930s onwards, it was at 500 Shettleston Road, where he lived with his mother at the time, and left there in 1936 to go to fight in Spain, Spanish Civil War. And he was in prison. One of the places he was held was Salamanca, and as chance would have it, there had been a big battle in Salamanca in 1812. So my father actually had a meeting to do with Bearmores, the forge, in April 1941, just next to Salamanca Street. So he'd gone for Salamanca prison to Salamanca Street in a matter of 4 years. So he was a member of the Communist Party. He joined the Communist Party in 1932, 16th of February, and was invited in May of that year to go to Moscow for the May Day parade, but he didn't go. But he went to Spain in 36, came back in 37, having been in prison for a few months. When the war broke out, a lot of the people that had been in the Communist Party were not welcome into the British Army until 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against Russia. And then everything changed, because what they were doing with the communists was stuck them out into the Far East. They didn't want them in the European theatre of war, so a lot of people that had served in Spain found themselves out in Burma and India, as my father did. But before that, what had happened was in November 1940, he started working at the forge, Parkhead Forge, Bearmores as he called it. And there was a problem with him. He was a brickies labourer, and there was a problem with getting a bonus for the men. So my father when we were growing up, my father, among his, he didn't talk an awful lot about the past. He was more interested in the present, but he would say he'd brought them out in strike, 2,000 men out in strike in 1941. But that he had said that, and when you become an academic, everything needs a footnote and a reference because you don't have it. So it just happened to be 2 or 3 years ago, I got my father's MI5 file, and there it was, something like 5th of April, 1941, chief mover in the strike at Bearmores at Parkhead Forge.
So he's a regular troublemaker.
Yeah, and two other big works at Dial and also, I can't remember the name of the other place, but 2 other big works came out at the same time. Then my father went on holiday. He was on strike, but he went down to the Saltcoats or something, and he got a telegram saying the strike's been resolved and you need to come back and organise a shift. So he did that, but yeah, he was down as chief mover. So I wrote a wee poem about called Chief Mover, about my dad being the person that brought that strike out. But thanks to MI5 and their scrupulous record keeping, they've got my dad used to lie about his height, but they've got his height in there and his colour of eyes and when he joined the party and various bits, and when he left for Spain, when he came back and all that. So that their record keeping was good. Otherwise, we didn't have, that was a gap. We didn't have, it's a thinly documented life, even though it was a very full life in terms of activism.
So what did he tell you about Beardmores?
I think what had happened was at one of the other places, the brickies labourers had got the bonus, but they weren't giving them the bonus there for whatever reason. I mean, they always tried to divide and rule anyway. Sure. But my father was a real agitator. He was known as a public speaker. He always carried his wee collapsible platform from Govan Cross to Glasgow Green, so he was known, and the tram driver would toot the horns when he passed. So he'd only been in there a few months, from November 1940 up to April 41, when he brought the men out in strike, and then a few months later, September, whatever it was, 1941, that was him away to India and then on to Burma. So that was his, so he just agitated for that, and he had a good shouting voice for bringing men out. I mean, I brought a photograph along of him when he worked in the railway, as he did later. And one of his railway stories was it took 12 men to lift one of the big sleepers, But the ganger wanted fewer men to do that, and they never did it for him. But when the ganger went away, he just gave the shout, and they lifted it, because fewer men were able to lift it, but only not for the ganger, and only with my father giving taking the lead. But yeah, he was quite formidable figure.
So he didn't go back to Bedmores after the war?
He didn't know. He was. My father had a long war and a complicated war, because he was in Burma. He used to talk about drinking water out of Irrawaddy River while dead bodies floated in it. He was a sniper, and he saw a lot of people die, but he killed people too. And then he stayed on at the end of the war, because he was working in a hospital for a little while, looking after the men and looking after. He wasn't a drinker himself, but he had access to a supply of beer for the men, so they had a fantastic time. And I think that was the best 6 weeks he had of all of his experiences in Spain and India and Burma. 8 years of kind of watching.
No, the reason I ask about the Forge was because it's such an iconic institution in the East End.
It's massively iconic.
A huge, employed, I don't know how many thousands of people, thousands and thousands of men. Yeah. And, now it's a shopping centre. So it's a kind of strange...
It's very sad when you think of Glasgow, that was building all these railway engines and Springburn and all the industries in Glasgow. It was that incredible hub. All the wealth seemed to disappear. The buildings were flattened. Promises of museums fell through. Nothing really survived. And it is sad that what's a shopping centre was this amazing workplace. And I actually found something out this morning which was remarkable, considering I'm supposed to be doing research in the history of the city. And that is that my university, the University of Glasgow, has got a remarkable archive on Beardmores. It's got photographs, stuff in meetings, all kinds of details. So I looked at what they had, just the catalogue, because I've not been in to look at it yet. I didn't see much about union activity or strikes or such like. It's a company records. But I definitely will take a look in there and see what it is they've got. And who knows, there's some beautiful pictures in the archive anyway of Beardmores. But yeah, that was that was my father's short working experience for him. He can't have been there more than 10, 11 months. Right. And it was a wartime experience, and then obviously they were switching to, it was important for armaments and all that.
Yeah, because I thought for a moment you were going to tell me that he had been a protected profession, whatever they called it, so that because they had to keep people in the factories, didn't they?
That's true.
Who didn't get called up, but no, obviously he wasn't that kind of person. So the stories that he would have told you, or you would have heard at your father's knee, your mother's knee, about living in Barlannick and so on. What do you remember apart from the sort of politics kind of thing? What about the rest of life?
My father, his line on it was growing up in the Carlton. It was a rowdy area. People hated the police. It was quite lawless, and he didn't say that in a lamentable or complaining
he probably
way.
Quite pleased.
So it was a very anti police and so on. On the historical record, the stories about the law enforcement forces going in there in the 1830s into the Carlton with machetes and such like to enforce order. So the Carlton was so heavily populated, just about everybody I know traces roots back to the Carlton. It was an extremely heavily populated area of the city, a lot of Irish immigrants and so on, lots of bars, lots of people, and I think it was a pretty rough neighbourhood.
And a radical one. I mean, the Carlton burial ground there is a kind of, you just have to walk around there, don't you, to get a sense of
that's right
of the story and the organisation and all of that.
And there was always meetings. I mean, my father joined the Communist Party at the age of 24 in 1932. But before that, the ILP, Anarchist Communist Party, it was a very radical area, and there was always meetings, and my father was always going along to those meetings as a boy and as a young man, because politics was talked in every street corner, not just at Glasgow Green. The men that came back for the war, my father always heard them constantly talking. The Iron Heel, the Jack London, that was talked about freely, and people saw things in the cinemas like Yellow Peril, this film made about 1912, and they started talking about China. And there was a massive interest in politics by people who weren't schooled except through agitated conversation.
He must have been just about old enough to remember the famous Red Clydeside election in 1921, was it?
I remember that. It was my father started working in 1922 at the age of 14, maybe even earlier than that. And he used to get about. His mother was a hawker, so she wheeled her wheelbarrow, as it were, her cart around, and the boys would kind of sit on top of it. So he was out and about for a very early age, my father, and men used to say to him, go to that meeting and tell us what's been said. So he was good at doing that and at working people out, and he got a kind of reputation for that, being able to know when there was rotters. Because I mean, we used to talk about Jimmy Maxson and that, and waving people off at the station, and the fact it was no good was expected to come of it. So in that sense, he was very cynical and very much for people have to do it for themselves. It's community grassroots sort of activism. That was his line. But the East End, in that sense, was my father's kind of a stamping ground in home territory.
So was it your sense that the East End was the real crucible? I mean, all the kind of stories of Red Clydeside and all the things that have become part of the city's folklore, but you would say that the East End was the sort of crucible for all that, would you?
I'm sure it was the East End, Springburn, Gorbals, and all these areas, but the East End in particular made a huge contribution. I don't know how much. I know there's been a few good books about the Carlton. Obviously, you've got McGinny the Carlton and all that, but I think there's probably a lot more work can be done on that. And I started to look back into, in fact, both sides of my family, my mother's side, and realised there was Carlton connections. So I think the Carlton was just such a seedbed for all kinds of behaviours, including radicalism.
It's quite interesting you mentioned McGinn, because that's the other side of it. There's tremendous creativity emerging out of that same tight-knit community.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's partly that. I mean, partly it will be the Irish aspect element to it as well, but then kind of protest song and people were really politically informed who you would not have expected to be. They had a kind of a street education and street conversations, every street corner, because my father used to say it wasn't just the meetings that were called, it was the meetings that people had, impromptu meetings in street corners where they would speak, and I think my father learned a lot of his politics from that. And you realise what people knew about the world before any social media, before any internet, before any proper, and when people were leaving school early or getting out of school at 12, 13, 14, they had that knowledge. And obviously there was a lot of things, there was pamphlets and different things, but even before the Communist Party, which started in 1920, before the Daily Worker, which started in 1930, whatever, there was massive streetwise knowledge of and interest in international politics, what was happening in Spain, what was happening particularly in Russia, and then the Easter Rising. My dad was 8 when that happened, and then my dad was 18 when the general strike happened. But he was around near George Square at the time of the 1918, 1919. So he remembers all of that, because although he was a young boy, my father, the first picture we have of my father is when he's 22. Don't have any photographs of my grandfather, who died in 1929. But my father was very, very streetwise. He was a very tough, rough guy.
So what would he, I suppose the kind of $64,000 question is, what would he think about the Carlton, Bichel, Darmanic and so on if he was to come back here now?
I think as long as Celtic Park was there, that would be a kind of a, and London Road and Gallowgate, and there's kind of ghost bits of it, an old bit like St Alphonsus Church and St James's Primary, I think that's the one he went to. So there's little bits of it, but he knew that change was coming, and it's terrible because we had all these builders, we had all these engineers, we had all these people with vision, we had no shortage of design talent, and yet we let car culture for the 1950s and 60s on. It was all about the cars. There was even a debate in Parliament in 1960 with somebody saying, you know, we're going to see a lot of deaths on the road if we stop using canals and and rail and start using roads for transport and bringing all these. And this is somebody talking 63 years ago in Parliament. It was actually a Tory MP for Aberdeen, and saying, what's the future if we decide that cars are the future? What's the future for the cities that we tear in half and rip to shreds for cars? And obviously cars were never going to be the future. So I think they did something for walkers, for cyclists, for trams, for a real transport infrastructure. They said goodbye to that when they said hello to the motorways, and they flattened all kinds. I mean, I know you needed to transform the housing, but the fact is, I would say they vindictively flattened places that they had a problem with. And if you looked at Glasgow, you would say, there's a city which has a reputation. Let's rip the guts out of it and see how they like that. And of course, people didn't like it much, and what's been left is pretty abject wherever you go. It's very kind of a generic and recognisable and one size fits all. Whereas you had these amazing. So my father walked the city for 100 years basically. He died at the age of 99. My father saw the city change around about him, and he saw beautiful old buildings crumbling and, you know, or being set on fire, and then bits of concrete and glass being thrown up. So he saw that evisceration of the city and was very aware of it. Because streets he grew up in, he grew up in Adelphi Street, gone, Stevenson Street, gone, Shettleston Road, the bit he stayed at gone and all. I used to joke and say if there's ever a documentary, they'll go back and look at these bits of waste ground or gap sites and say this was, and that's the primary school gone, secondary school gone, you name it. I mean, St Alphonsus at least has managed to stay on its feet. That's probably the one contemporary institution that my father would be.
So he wouldn't recognise it, in short.
In short, he wouldn't recognise it. And he used to go, my father, although we had a bath, even when we had a bath in the house, my father used to go to the local baths to have one of these baths. I went with him a few times with baracarbolic soap and your bath up to there. And he used the city's facilities that had historically been there that were wisely introduced, you know, and although he was never in a hospital, he'd part of his lung removed in 1926. When he was 18, he had the last rites. He was never in a hospital again as a patient till he was 99 and dying. But all these beautiful hospitals that were built with high ceilings, natural light, beautiful landscape gardens, you know, treating TB, and all of that's gone. It's just car park, multi-storey car park, airport terminal. That's how everything looks. So I think definitely he would, and for the East End in particular, because just great swathes of the East End were flattened. So he would recognise there's a ghost of Stevenson Street where he stayed is still there, and obviously Shettleston Road's there, but it's not the number he stayed.
You still have they put the big hammer from Beardmore's, didn't they, on the end of the street there?
They put that down there.
Kind of a bit of a grudging acknowledgement. This is great. Let me just ask you one other question, which is kind of a bit offside. Do you have any relationship with the river? Probably not if you moved up to Possil and so on, but I just wondered.
Only insofar as my dad walked every inch of Glasgow and was always around Clydeside, and I think his only connection with the river would be, you know, he would have known people in the yards and he would have walked the river. That was probably his thing. I don't know if it's so easy to walk the river now as it was when he did, but he walked an unbroken.
Yeah, no, actually, I mean that's partly what this whole project is about walking along the river, But yeah, you can obviously walk through that bit at what's it called? White Inch. There's a shipyard. What's it called?
Yeah.
On the north side.
I know what it's called.
Anyway, there.
Yoker and all that.
Yeah, exactly. But apart from that,
see, there is a thing there about heritage and all that, because you would say there was a canals and that went down when the railways come in, and there was a railways in the river for a long time. There's a lot to be said ecologically for what you can do with railways and rivers. And they were very significant, but it became the roads, and that's why people started to say, wait a minute, factories historically you would build them, you know, near to a river, near to a canal, near to a main rail line and all that, and then suddenly you had, no, it's all road, so the switch to road transport had consequences for places where the river would have been the artery, just as the Forth and Clyde Canal. I mean, it came in and it was, for 60 or 70 years, it was just the most incredible, frictionless transport system, and for all kinds of purposes. It was thought to be they'd arrived, as it were, and then the railways comes along and cuts through that, and then later it's all road.
And they call it progress. This is brilliant, Willie. Thank you so very much.